Everyone, and welcome to Webinar 3. Our topic for our time together today is going to be around building trust. This is Lori Kier, and I'm going to be guiding you through the webinar today. We have quite a bit of material to cover, so let's go ahead and jump in and get started. I want to take a moment to just provide a brief summary of where we've been. We've actually gone quite a bit in the last couple of months. When we started in November with our orientation session and the pre-work, we've had our kickoff session where we talked about burnout and emotional intelligence. We've moved into concepts of presence and consequential thinking. Each of you had an opportunity to respond to the discussion question at the end of both of those webinars. And I wanted to share with you just a little bit of feedback around those discussions. We're going to talk quite a bit more about this at the midpoint, but when I looked at some of the trends from your learning thus far, some of the items that seem most relevant to you were the idea of staying low on the ladder. When we talked about the ladder of inference, that whole notion of not jumping to conclusions. You were also really wanting to focus on getting cautious and curious about the judgments you make and how they might impact your relationships. Another item that came forward from a great deal of responses was the whole notion that you wanted to honor the pause between stimulus and response. How do you give yourself, again, a little bit more space to think about your reaction and ponder your reaction before you actually act? Several of you also commented that the case study was incredibly relevant to the work, but that you wanted a few more details about how to do the situation differently, how the physician could have responded in a more effective way. The midpoint retreat is really going to be our opportunity to delve into not only that case study, but at least one or two others. But I want to give you a little bit of information today, so I will be pulling in that case study to our dialogue today. So before we move forward into the whole notion of trust, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about growth and development and how we learn. The first and perhaps primary way we grow in our learning is through what I call horizontal development. And this is really where we move from being a novice to an expert at any particular task or skill. When we think about medical school, training courses that we've taken, or a lot of our on-the-job experiences, these are all examples of learning in this domain of horizontal growth. Because this is our primary method of learning, we often believe that this is the only way for us to gain new insights and skills. But what we know as we go through our own self-development is that a lot of our learning occurs at what I call the vertical growth level. And vertical growth is really about transformational learning. It's that place where we deepen our own skills by broadening our worldview, assessing attributes of ourselves and our behaviors that are either helping or hindering us as we try and achieve a goal. This aspect of learning really requires a great deal of reflection. It requires us to kind of consider from the perspective of self, what's worked for us in the past and what hasn't worked for us in the past. There's a book title that I love, and it's called What Got You Here Won't Get You There. When we think about vertical growth and development, it's really about assessing where have I been successful and where do I actually need to change my strategy if I'm going to be successful going forward. So when we think about the ideas in this particular program, particularly the elements of emotional intelligence, we really have to combine both of these learning types. So we teach skills at that horizontal level, but we also recognize that the true growth and transformation is going to come from the exploration of your personal style, your strengths and weaknesses, and how these concepts apply to your individual challenges and situations. So given that as a foundation, let's jump into the concept of trust. The definition on your screen comes to us from the International Coach Federation. We know that trust is a crucial element of our vertical growth and development. We also know that trust requires that we show up in a number of different ways if we're going to support relationships that will sustain us at a deeper level. So the first item that the ICF talks about is the need or ability to create safe, supportive environments of mutual respect when we're really seeking to engage in trusting relationships. One of the examples that I like to use is the work that we do with nursing leaders and quality teams around just cultures or cultures of safety. One of the things we hear frequently is that a significant barrier to safety cultures is the intimidation or the fear-based behavior of physicians, the inability of physicians to actually create these safe, supportive environments of trust. So kind of keep that in mind as we continue through our dialogue today. The second bullet point that's required for trust is that we show genuine concern for the other person's welfare and future. We're going to talk here in a little bit about the notion of benevolence, and this is really where benevolence and positive intent show up. Third, we want to be able to continuously demonstrate personal integrity, honesty, and sincerity. If at our core we don't have elements of integrity, it is very difficult for us to enter into relationships from a place of trust. It's difficult for others to trust us, and it's difficult for us to extend trust. Fourth is around establishing clear agreements and keeping promises. One of the things we know about trust is that when we break commitments, it's one of the fastest ways that we violate trust. Oftentimes in our classes, we talk about trust bank accounts. It's actually a concept that Stephen Covey coined. And we know that in every interaction, we're either making deposits into our trust account with another person or we're making withdrawals. And when we don't follow through on our commitments, it can be one of the quickest ways to deplete that bank account. When we discussed MATED in our first session, we talked a little bit about patients understanding the duration of time, either between a test or procedure or when they can expect to see their nurse again or whatever that might be. And this commitment is so critical that we need to ensure that we're being accurate. And if we can't keep to an agreement that's been made, we either have to notify the other person or somehow renegotiate that commitment. So be it with our patients or our colleagues or our families, we need to make sure that we recognize that this is a really pivotal element of our ability to build and gain trust. And finally, one of our responsibilities in trust is to provide ongoing support that really champions new behaviors and actions. As I mentioned before, I think physicians play a really significant role in developing trust amongst the care team, and that care team includes the patient. And so what we want to consider is how do we use trust to help forward action, to actually support our ability to get results. So next, let's talk a little bit more about these elements of trust and maybe position it from a little bit of a different framework. So again, this framework comes from the Speed of Trust as a resource. And what I like to do with this is consider this from the metaphoric perspective of a tree. And so we think about it, when we think about a tree, we can look at the roots of the tree really being about our character. How are we showing up from a place of integrity? And can we enter into interactions with positive intent or strong benevolence? The leaves of the tree then really represent competence, our ability to have strong capabilities, capacity, and skill sets in whatever area we're focused on. Ultimately, we want those capabilities to deliver on results, and so that's the other piece of competence. The one point that I might make here that's highly relevant is our ability to be competent looks very different in various relationships that we hold. So you being competent in an interaction with a patient as their physician shows up much differently than your competence as a parent when you're having an interaction of trust with your child. So just some different pieces to keep in mind there. I want to go into these a little bit deeper, and I'm going to do so from the perspective of some of the tools that I want to introduce. So the first tool I want to talk a little bit about is the trust self-assessment. And then based on that, I'm going to quickly share with you a slide about do's and don'ts that kind of summarize that self-assessment. And then I want to explore a little bit about word choices, and then we'll do a quick MATED review. So the trust self-assessment you'll find as an attachment to the email that I sent. And it's broken up into three categories. The first one is character trust, which we talked about a little bit ago. It's the roots of the tree. The second then will be competency trust. So that'll be the slide after this. And then we're going to talk about the trust that kind of bridges both of those things. So we might consider that to be the trunk. So let's delve into the character piece a little bit. When you look at this assessment, you'll see items on the left-hand side. These are really the desired behaviors. So when we think about building trust, these are the behaviors that we have to engage in. These are our do's, so to speak. And on the right-hand side, you'll see opposite behaviors. When we engage in these types of behaviors, we actually diminish trust in our relationships. And so these can be translated as our don'ts. You'll see in the middle an opportunity for you to rate yourself along the continuum. So you can take a look and see on these different elements, would you score yourself at a 1 or a 5 or somewhere in the middle? So when we think about character trust, the first piece is really this notion of talking straight. Am I sharing things from an open, honest perspective? Do people know that they're going to get accurate, concise, and truthful information from me? Or do I have a tendency to double talk, tell half truths, maybe lie, or tell little white lies, or spin the truth? Flattery is also an element here. Sometimes we can flatter as a way of manipulating and getting what we want. And so if we engage in those kinds of behaviors, recognizing from a character perspective that that can have trust implications. So take a moment and just kind of rank yourself on that continuum where you see yourself falling. The second one is really about respect. We have to be able to demonstrate respect in our relationships. And so do we show up from a place of being respectful of others, or do we not show respect or even disrespect? Or perhaps we only show respect based on someone's position in the organization or whether they can do something for you. So you can kind of take a little bit of time to look at that. One point of note as we're going through this assessment is to really kind of consider if there are certain relationships or certain people where you might be at risk of demonstrating some of this counter behavior. So what we know is that we might not be respectful to everyone across the board. There might be certain populations or certain individuals that just trigger us in a way that will engage in some of these less productive behaviors. So make a mental note if you find yourself thinking about that. So the third element in terms of transparency is that, or in terms of trust, is that we really want to create transparency. We really want to be as open as possible. Oftentimes people will say, well, you can't be open about everything. And that's true. But what we can do is be honest when we can't be open, and we can tell people, you know, I'd really like to share that with you, but I'm not able to share it at this point. So the more we can be transparent about where we're at, the more we can build trusting relationships, as opposed to the other end of the continuum where we're withholding information. So moving along, do we right wrongs? Do we admit our mistakes and seek to correct them? Or do we cover up our mistakes? And then finally, are we someone who shows loyalty? Or do we find ourselves being backbiting, gossipy, and maybe taking credit for other people's work? So the second part of the assessment is really around competence trust. So are you someone who delivers results? Or are you someone who actually focuses a lot on activities, but isn't really able to generate results? And I had a really good example that actually just came up for me a couple of hours ago in regards to this. There's a leader that we're coaching, and she's really experiencing some needs to change some of her results around, her outcomes around. And she's finding that she's got a really great to-do list, a really great action plan, but those actions don't necessarily translate to results. And so there's this sense from her that I'm doing all of this really great work, but it's not necessarily the right work to drive an outcome. So that's an example of how, you know, even with the best of intentions, sometimes we can find ourselves spinning in a way that doesn't promote a level of competence. So the next item on the list is, are you someone who is really about process improvement and making things better? Or do you find yourself kind of forcing solutions to a problem into one box? Are you possibility oriented on the left, or are you kind of narrow-minded on the right? Third is confront reality. I love this whole concept because on the one side, we've got this notion of confronting reality. On the other side, we have this piece of, am I in denial? Do I bury my head in the sand? Or am I actually skirting the real issues? And what we need to recognize with confronting reality is not about always laying everything on the table in this brusque, harsh, honest way. When we confront reality, it's really about how are we bringing forth relevant issues from a place of positive intention. The other thing we know about confronting reality from our previous webinars is that our reality is just that. It's our perception of the situation. And so if we're not cautious, we can actually be confronting the wrong reality. And so as you think about this from a trust perspective, if you're confronting the wrong reality, you can break down trust very, very quickly because I will feel attacked and persecuted as a result of you questioning something and bringing something forth. So we really have to be clear amongst ourselves, what judgments are we making about a situation? What perceptions are we bringing forward? What biases and mental models do we have so that we can clean those out internally before we come forward and begin to kind of confront a reality? What we also know is that we have a responsibility to confront a reality from a healthy place. So that means that we've got to do so in a highly respectful way. And so we've got to merge all of those pieces together as we think about this. So when you assess confronting reality, I really ask you to think about whether you confront reality from a very aware, respectful place, or are you in denial or confronting the wrong reality? So next is clarifying expectations. We are very aware that expectations are one of the most pivotal foundations of any relationship, and that this can be a place where trust can break down, because if I have a certain familiarity or perception of what's expected of me from your lens, but I'm wrong, then I'm not actually adhering to what your expectations are through no fault of my own because I had a misinterpretation. So are we able to be really clear with our expectations? And can we seek mutual agreement about those? Or do we just assume people know their expectations? Are we kind of vague around them? Or do we shift our expectations on a regular basis? This is a really great place to get feedback from others, because others can help us to understand whether we're setting clear expectations or not. This can be with our care teams. This can be in terms of orders that we've made. This can be in relation to compliance types of things with our patients. So expectations is a really pivotal piece when we think about competency trust. And finally, do we practice accountability, or do we fall into victim mindsets and not take responsibility? This links perfectly into the dialogue that we had at our last webinar around consequential thinking and reasoned choice. Do we take an ownership spirit, which would be our accountability model, or do we have a tendency to fall into that victim thinking? And finally, these are the elements that kind of are our trunk of our tree. So listening, are we someone who really listens and not just listens for the words or listens for someone to say something through our own lens, but can we listen for mutual agreements? Can we listen for mutual intent? Can we also listen not only to the words, but to nonverbals that we're hearing, or even an intuitive sense? And we're going to dialogue a lot more about listening, but at what level do we listen? And do we listen first to understand? Or on the other side of the continuum, do we speak? Do we pretend to listen, or do we listen without really understanding the intent of the other person? We've talked quite a bit about keeping commitments. So are you someone who keeps the commitments and agreements, or are you someone who makes vague commitments or maybe doesn't keep those and breaks those? And finally, when we think about trust, are you someone who extends trust, or are you someone who is a little bit more skeptical in terms of your relationships? And the piece that I love about this particular one is what we know from personality theory is we each, from just the core of our being, have a tendency to be either trusting or more skeptical. And my guess is each of you know for yourselves where you fall on that continuum. Some of us trust implicitly until we're completely burned, and others of us, you have to prove your trust before you get even an ounce of the trust from me. So what I want to share with you is, without judgment, no right or wrong, what we need to recognize is that when we're in relationship with other people, if we don't extend trust, then we struggle to gain trust. It's more effort for us to get trust when we're skeptical right from the onset. So take some notes, jot down some thoughts and ideas about where you're at along those different continuums. So what I'd like for you to do at this point is take an opportunity to pull out your 4 questions. When we looked at the 4 questions, remember that you asked your raters to rank order you along these 6 different dimensions. You could have been really great at all 6, but we really wanted to force your raters into one of those 6 categories. So I'm going to go back at this point and talk a little bit about the comment that I just made. When you think about your pre-work, one of the things to consider with this is whether you had raters that ranked you differently. So again, did your family and friends rate you differently than perhaps your coworkers? And if so, where did you see that and what might that mean? The other thing I want you to consider is if for some reason you did not get a high response rate to this particular piece of the assignment, something to keep in mind that you might consider is whether the person you asked feels like they can be in a trusting, open, honest relationship with you. So oftentimes what we find is that when people can't answer this question, they don't feel safe to do so. So may or may not be the truth for you, but something just to kind of keep in mind and consider. So I'm going to pause here for a second because I kind of jumped the gun a little bit ago. But when we think about the trust self-assessment that we just took, and we look at it in conjunction with these 6 elements, what I want you to consider is, where do you have some trends that stood out? Where do you see something that might be worth exploring further or might enhance your own awareness? These 6 items were chosen for a very specific reason. These 6 items, these soft skills you might call them, when we're good at these 6 things, our emotional intelligence is stronger, our relationships are stronger. We also know that these 6 items link very closely to our ability to establish trusting relationships. So when we can be compassionate in our interactions, when we can be a strong listener, when we can manage conflict well, it helps us to address those elements of trust that we just talked about. So take a moment, not a very long moment, unless you want to pause the webinar, which you're welcome to do, but just take a quick moment and jot down any insights that you might be having, either from just a quick analysis of your 4 questions or from the trust assessment that we just did. Okay. There is just so much content here to get through, so I'm going to keep jumping forward. Again, feel free to pause if you need to. So the second tool that I want to share with you is just a quick list of trust do's and don'ts. I'm not going to go through this slide detail by detail because I think we actually just walked through a lot of these in our conversation around the trust self-assessment. But essentially, this is just a quick little slide that helps you to understand what should I and shouldn't I do if I want to build trust in my relationships. Okay, so let's delve into word choices a little bit. I love the whole notion of word choices because what I believe is that our words can have a significant impact on whether we create safe, trusting conversations or whether we actually initiate defensive, fear-based dialogues. Words hold an emotional energy, and some words have a more negative charge when they're used in our discussions than others. And so when we look at this slide, these are words that I would call potent words. These are words that hold a much more negative energy to them. So one of the comments we received in the discussion, I think, is something that bears mentioning. The comment was that when we look at some of the strategies and techniques, it feels like we're actually just manipulating the conversation, and that may seem superficial. What I hope to do is really offer you some transformational strategies. And with that transformation, remember that we've got to change some of our internal paradigms. We have to come to this desire to alter our language and behavior. But if we merely manipulate our language without fundamentally altering those internal paradigms, we really become ineffective at the change and ineffective in our relationships. So it's not only about being cautious of your words, but it's about recognizing that this is kind of a piece of that internal transformation that you're hopefully starting to achieve. So let's start with the word why. Why is a very defensive question. It often immediately sets the tone for argument. Why did you order that test? Why did you do it that way? When we use a softer tone, we can get to the same outcome without creating that defensive, that need to justify our behavior. So one way we can do that is by saying, tell me more, or talk to me about the decision you made here, or something to that effect. Gets us to the same outcome, but does so in a way that doesn't elevate the emotional experience of the other person. As always, these are not hard and fast rules. We don't always want to avoid these words necessarily, but what we want to do is become a little bit more conscious of when we use them and whether they're effective for us. So the second recommendation I have for you is really to avoid the word should. We can replace it with the word could or would. So the word should is kind of an interesting one because what it does is it introduces control and guilt. Even in our own language, when we say that we should be doing something, it often reflects someone else's expectations of us. So when we think about replacing it with the word could or would, it becomes much more self-empowering. It's much more open and possibility focused. So as opposed to saying something like, you should be seeking a psych eval for this patient, we might say, I think a psych eval would be helpful. Can you assist me in getting that moving? The next one is and over but. So again, using the word but can really lead to feelings of discountedness, and it can actually negate a previous statement, again, setting us up for a more argumentative tone. And is much more inclusive and respectful as a word and a conjunction. So an example might be, I think you provide good care, but you made an error and we need to resolve this, versus you provide good care and we made a mistake. We've got to get this fixed and rectified. Try versus will. Try is a very passive word. It leaves a lot of room for ambiguity and misinterpretation. It also still represents a commitment. So we might think, well, I'm going to try and do that. So it's a little bit of a softer commitment, but people actually hear it as a harder commitment. So we're much better off using the word will and making sure that we can commit to something that we can achieve. Willing to. So a Harvard researcher who she actually has a TED Talk if anybody's interested. She did a lot of study around word choice, and she found that if people are asked if they're willing to do something, they are much more likely to comply with the request than when they are told to do something. So really that word willing to gives us a sense of choice and empowerment in our decision making. So definitely one to consider using. Avoid the word just. Just is something that discounts. When we say just nursing or just mid-level providers or just housekeeping or any of those terms, we really start to discount the role that people play. And so avoiding that word can be really useful because oftentimes we don't intend to use the word that way, but it definitely comes across that way. And so even amongst this group, and as we think about our interactions with each other, this is an area that has surfaced in the discussion questions as a potential friction point in our ability to build trusting relationships with one another, which is one of the reasons that I brought it up. We've already talked a little bit about what versus do you. When we say, do you have any questions, it limits the dialogue. It's a yes-no question. Anytime we ask what, it's a powerful statement. It really opens up the opportunity for further questions and dialogues. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the case study as we're rapidly running out of time. So recall from webinar 2 that we had a patient that came to the ED with severe back pain. In the case study, there were several times when the physician used words that were not helpful in the interaction. So the first line is, what brings you to the ED at 2 a.m.? It's a great open-ended question. It's something that seems very appropriate for the dialogue, a nice place to start. However, as the patient proceeded to explain that she was having back pain, the physician immediately asked, why didn't you call your doctor? That why question, regardless of the tone, really sets up the rest of the encounter. Within 2 sentences, it really took the conversation down a path towards disaster. So remember that this is a real example from an actual conversation. And if at that moment the physician would have asked a powerful question, the entire conversation would have gone differently. So for example, when the patient shares she's having back pain, the doctor might ask, tell me more about your pain. Is this something recent or have you struggled with it for some time? Are you seeing a primary care doctor for your pain? What plan have you and your doctor developed to best manage your pain? Those are some different ways that we can introduce word choice in a way that supports us in the interaction and builds trust with our patient as opposed to immediately diminishing it. The physician also inserted a great deal of judgment in some of his previous or his subsequent statements, and I really do want to get into a little bit of that as we talk at our midpoint retreat. So another example from that particular case study, the patient claims that her pain is a 10, but the physician sees her relaxing. He proceeds to get into an argument where she says she's in pain, he says she's not because he saw her relaxing, and immediately we're in this conflict that only goes downhill from that place. Violates trust from both parties, and both parties leave feeling unfairly treated and incredibly disrespected. So from a physician perspective, you as a physician don't always have to trust your patients, but it's pretty important that your patients trust you. And so this is that place where we kind of step into a new space and really consider what can we do at every point of our interaction with every word that we speak and with every place from our being, ensure that we're creating relationships of trust. So as we wind down our dialogue, I want to just reintroduce Made It. And so you'll see here that we've got Made It down the side, and we can begin to see how Made It really does, when we implement it accurately, give us an opportunity to build trust at the various levels. Whew, I feel like we've gone through a ton of content in a relatively short amount of time. And there was actually quite a bit that I removed. And so I'm hopeful that all of the pieces that we kept were useful. But there's going to be some really great optional assignments that'll come forward in the next couple of weeks. And I'm excited about our dialogue at the Midpoint Retreat. If you haven't already scheduled a time, I will be emailing you shortly to get you on the calendar for one of those retreats. If you have scheduled a time, you should have an appointment on your calendar already. Those will be the last 2 weeks of March, and so we'll have an opportunity to come back together in person then. We're going to do a summary of our discussion questions. So all of you have responded to those, and there's some nice trends and themes that are coming out, both positive and some that you're a little challenged by, so we want to dialogue about those. We want to talk about resiliency, spend a little bit of time dialoguing about the case study analysis. And we're actually going to introduce a second case study as well, as our hope, and then do a few fun things. So bring your SMART goal to the midpoint. You started to craft that earlier. Bring that on, and we're going to continue working with that. If you haven't developed your SMART goal yet, some of your discussion points and some of the areas that you wanted to focus on would make great SMART goals. And then the third thing is, remember that you still have optional coaching available. So we are introducing these concepts to 100 different people with 100 different personalities and 100 different challenges. The optional coaching really is an opportunity for you to spend 30 minutes with a coach, dialogue a little bit about your challenges and how these concepts specifically apply to you, so we can make the content a little bit more relevant should you choose to participate in that. So thank you for your time today. Here's your discussion question. Please take a moment to respond to it on the website. And we are excited to see you in just a couple of weeks. Have a great week, and we'll talk soon.